Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sending immense greetings and salutations upon the final Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. We find in his prophetic guidance and prophetic words, guidance for this Muslim ummah until the end of time, especially whereby we find moments of exuberance and being overzealous, and moments of extreme laxity or laziness that we find, two extremities that we find inside this Muslim ummah. And in all honesty, we find that these extremities always exist in everything that we do. That's the Quranic manhaj is, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. We made this ummah to become the middle nation, never to go to the two extremes. That's why even these ayyam of kufr that we find, the Quran talks about al-ghulu, about excessiveness. Ya Ahl al-Kitab, la taghlu fi dinikum. The people of the book, do not become over excessive inside your praise, inside your worship, and other elements that we find. And this that we find begins to exist even amongst us Muslims as well, that we go from one extreme to the other extreme. Khayrul umur awsatuha, the best of affairs are remaining inside the middle. So we find that the asas of the Muslim is trying to use the word linguistically, perfect the fundamentals. Man lam yutqin al-usul hurima min al-usul. Whoever does not know the principles of their faith, of their deen, will be prevented from coming to the fruits for the benefit. And thus we find that the whole min ma'ani of tarbeeyyah that we find, of cultivation and pruning and educating, it has certain stages that we find. When people are not given the right stages, you find what is known as al-fawda. You find corruption beginning to take place. Because kullu man dabba wa habba, any single individual thinks that they have a solution or they have some form of Islamic credentials to begin to rectify people. And thus they begin to become overzealous. And when that, as they say, that smoke or that heat, it withers away, they return back, and even the basic fundamental things become a great big mountain for them, becomes a great big burden for them. So you find that people كانوا يهتمون بالدين, were worried about the deen, حتى بزي الإسلامي, the Islamic dress or etiquette that we find, and after a short span of مراحل ستة شهور أو سنة that we find, or even beyond that, unfortunately, the person begins to drift away, and they find difficulty even holding fast the basic elements of the teachings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The role of the Muslim, وَلَكِنْ كُونُوا رَبَّانِيِّينَ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَعَلِّمُونَ الْكِتَابِ وَبِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَدْرُسُونَ. A teacher is the one who teaches, nurtures the people, and gives them, as Ibn Abbas mentions about this, is ilmun nafi', the beneficial knowledge that concerns them to help them to become a better individual. And likewise we find, when we lose focus towards al-akhirah, the Quran begins by talking about al-mu'minun. Who are they? الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ, who believe in the unseen. So that's when world politics, for example, don't fit into our paradigm and our understanding. Person doesn't become frustrated. Person doesn't despair. Person doesn't lose hope. وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ اللَّهَ غَافِلًا عَمَّا يَعْمَلُ الظَّالِمُونَ. Don't think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ghafil, is heedless, is unaware of what al-zalimun are doing. So some of us in our frustration, whether we take the law into our own hand or doing certain actions that we find, when the result is not presented in front of us, we begin to get frustrated. We begin to lose hope. We begin to drift away. And likewise we find the fundamentals what we're supposed to be carrying out in that devotion towards al-akhirah begin to wither away. Those mundane rituals we have to carry out, they become, may Allah excuse us, an obstacle for some of us. An obstacle after trying to think of such lofty goals, they become an obstacle inside our life. And that's when a person focuses towards the akhirah and rectifies the iman. You find inside in the hadith that each one of you rejuvenate, revitalize their iman. Because iman is like a thawb, it's like a garment, it withers away, becomes tatters, becomes rags, begins to have holes. You need to revitalize your iman, refresh your iman, to become focused back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, we find that if everything was just based upon that exertion of just going towards one direction and not finding moments of balancing oneself, you find that the malaika, the angels, will come down and begin to greet the believers, extracted from the hadith of Hanbala, whereby he mentioned that he feels that when he returns back to his family members, that he's committed some element of hypocrisy, of not having that same level of Iman while sitting with the Prophet ﷺ, wa Rasulu fikum, the messenger is amongst you. And that's why Abu Bakr, he felt the same as well. But what did the Prophet ﷺ advise? Ya Hanzala sa'atan wa sa'atan. There's a time for you to be exuberant and to be focused inside your life, and there's a time for certain issues, they are mubah, they are halal, they are allowed for a person to do under the guidance of the Qur'an and Sunnah. They don't become an element of wasting one's time or focus towards al-akhirah. And that's we find that the hadith that we want to focus upon today, which came to mind, is اغتنم خمسا قبل خمس. Take benefit of 5 before 5. شبابك قبل حرمك. Your youth age before you fall old in age. وصحتك قبل سقمك. Your good health before you may fall ill. وغناك قبل فقرك. Your richness of having wealth and whatever you possess before you become in a state of being a poor individual. وفراغك قبل شغلك. Your spare time before you become busy. وحياتك قبل موتك. And your life before your death. And there's various variations of this hadith, kalimat, hatta in the isnad and the matn that we find, various variations that ulama have collected. And we're not going to enter into that because it's not a dars al-ilmi to dissect the hadith. But it can be shakl al-am in this hadith with these various wordings that we find. Akhrajahu Imam al-Hakim inside his Mustadrak and checked by the Shaykh al-Sham Nasiruddin al-Albani rahmatullahi alayh. So we just focus upon the general text of the hadith because this is a maqam of maw'idah, admonition, and not to get so much, excuse the expression, bogged down into the technicalities of the hadith. In general, it's acceptable. So we want to look at these 5, taking benefit of 5 before 5. The main thrust of the hadith is one of preparation, of isti'dad, that how the believer prepares themselves. Whether it be a global element of preparation, or whether it be a personal element of preparation, we can see the state of our affairs. If we look at the global impact, the Qur'an mentions inside Surah Al-Anfal that we find, وَعِدُّ لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ وَمِن رِبَاطِ الْخَيْلِ. Qur'an mentions, and prepare for them all the steeds of warfare, and cavalry, and horses, and whatever you need to prepare yourself. So the Qur'an is highlighting preparation. You know, as a side point, the Muslim Ummah has no real Muslim army. Every single country has its army to defend whatever it may be. We don't want to enter into that, but just to have fikrah, help us to understand. Qur'an, tushir, وَعِدُّ لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ. Prepare yourselves in whatever is needed in any element of warfare. This is the global state of affairs of the Muslims that we find in general, a lack of preparation. Then we find the daily ritual preparation of the believer, that some of us may begin to undermine it, because we're trying to look at the two extremities, that looking at world politics and change of world politics, and then we find that people in other elements, they begin to drift away. We don't find the balance between the personal affair and the global affair. Both are linked together. Person has to fight both struggles on both fronts. Personal affairs they may face inside their life, and the global affairs that they face. That's what makes a complete believer, a Muslim, that their focus is placing everything inside the right parameter. That is al-hikmah. Al-hikmah, wisdom, is وَضْعُ الشَّيْءِ فِي مَكَانِهِ, to be able to place everything inside its right compartment. And whoever's been given hikmah, فَقَدْ أُوتِيَ خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا. Yes, we find whoever's been given wisdom is given immense goodness, because wisdom isn't given to every single individual. There's a fiqh in understanding the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As you find sometimes fuqaha, people who extract the right rulings, they may not excel as some other individuals who are able to interpret the law, implement the law, and apply the law. That they may go further beyond. That is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He bestows wisdom upon whoever He wants, subhanahu wa ta'ala. ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِيهِ مَن يَشَاءُ. That is the virtue and blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He bestows upon whoever He wants. But رَدُّ الْفِعْلِ الْإِنسان. But the real believing individual is وَأَحْسِنْ كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ. Show goodness to people like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala show goodness to you. So the person is exerting the effort to help people لِكَيْ يُخْرِجُهُم مِّنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ, to help people to come out of the realms of darknesses to the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the minor task that we find that some of us may begin to slacken, what is this minor task that the Qur'an tushir? Qur'an points to وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ. Some 80 odd occasions out of Qur'an. حتى الكلمة إقامة الصلاة. We study in deep حتى لغة والشرع that we find is different between وأدوا الصلاة. Just perform the prayer, carry out the prayer. Quran says, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ. Establish the prayer. بِمَعْنَى قَبْلَ الصَّلَاةِ قَبْلَ دُخُولِ الصَّلَاةِ. Before you enter into the prayer, you are preparing yourself. You are preparing yourself psychologically, biologically, everything to get prepared to enter into the prayer. It's not a case of that where you find the opportunity that you offer the prayer and, as they say, to get it over done with. Done with. Maybe shar'an, it becomes the prayer has been completed. But ruhaniyan, in the state of spirituality, devotion, commitment, and ajr, what does the Quran mention? وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ وَإِنَّا لَكَبِيرَةٌ إِلَّا عَلَى الْخَاشِعِينَ. Seek aid and assistance in what? Inside the prayer. وَالصَّبْرِ. Indeed, it's going to be something very difficult or burdensome, except for the people who are submissive to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thus Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes sifatul mu'mineen, descriptive nature of the mu'minun, inside Surah Al-Mu'minun. In the beginning of Surah Al-Mu'minun, the 23rd chapter of the Quran, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the believers, the successful believers. Who are they? And lists some 11 or 12 different characteristics of them, and begins by mentioning those individuals who are submissive instead of khushu' inside their prayers. Those are the individuals, الَّذِينَ يَرِثُونَ الْفِرْدَوْسِ وَهُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. They're going to inherit paradise. Is going to be given to an inheritance of Firdaus al-A'la will be given to those individuals. And likewise the Quran uses such words as حَافِظُوا عَلَى الصَّلَوَاتِ وَالصَّلَاةِ الْوُسْطَى وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ. Quran says حَافِظُوا, guard your prayers, all of your prayers, and Salatul Wusta. وَقَوْلُ رَاجِحْ, that what is the middle prayer is Salatul Asr. It's classified as a middle prayer. Various hadith that we find of making istidlal. For مثلا in such Sahih Muslim that we find that the middle prayer, Salatul Asr, if a person misses it, it's as if they lost their whole family and all of their wealth. Ulama of hadith made sure of this because this is a time that many people get busy in the latter afternoon, busy with the things that they're doing, and their prayer begins to get delayed. And if they miss just one Salatul Asr because they're worried about where they're playing with their family, with their children, or earning their wealth, it's as if they've lost all of that. And thus you find that some harsh statements in the fuqaha, لكي يرخبنا يخوفنا, to awaken us. We're not making any hukum at any individual. Some of the fuqaha وهم أقلة, a minute view that exists there, but just to refresh our iman. Person who misses one prayer, فقد كفر. Person who misses one salah is a disbeliever. These are aqwal, documented works of fuqaha. Doesn't mean that we're trying to apply that upon ourselves or any individual around us, but it's to awaken us that if that extreme affair has been mentioned there, that person misses one prayer amdan, intentionally, he misses it, then that person has left the fold of al-Islam. الْأَهْدُ الَّذِي بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَهُمْ الصَّلَاةِ فَمَنْ تَرَكَهَا فَقَدْ كَفَرَ. The covenant between us and them, the distinction between us and them is as-salah. This is not necessarily a distinction, it could be good. The Coptic Egyptians dress like this, and Yahud, they grow their beards. These are all good things. Some of them are fara'id, fundamentals we have to do. But this isn't a distinction. It's one of the distinctions. The real distinction of the Muslim is as-salah. أَحَبُّ الْأَعْمَالِ إِلَى اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى الصَّلَاةِ عَلَى وَقْتِهَا. The most beloved thing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is prayer at its right time. So some people, they find this trivial, that Sham is burning, Iraq is tortured, this is happening, that's happening, and all you want to talk about is as-salah. This shows a lack of conviction, a lack of understanding. You know, I've met individuals, مَا يُصَلُّونَ, don't pray, but they will march and riot and do everything and stay there all day. وَلَكِنْ مَا يُصَلُّونَ, they don't pray. They feel, this is what Muslims come, they feel that this is me doing something for this Muslim ummah. وَوَقْتُ الْفَجْرِ نَائِمُونَ وَحَتَّى شَبَابُنَا كَمْ مِنْ شَبَابِنَا. How many of our youth come for Salatul Fajr who are there? Or even Salatul Isha that we find. As they say, grabbing a munch, getting something to eat, تأخر الجماعة مرة في شهر مرة في شهرين ممكن يحصل, once in a month, once in 2 months. Don't use the hadith that I'm hungry, that then I need to miss Salatul Jama'ah. Even the hadith in its comprehension means أنت في السفر رجعت من السفر أو من التعب, you come from a long journey or something, whatever it may be. So مرة تطبقه, once in a while you implement the hadith. Every week you miss Jama'ah inside the masjid because you're eating some food. هذا ليس من المؤمنين. You find that Salatul Isha or Salatul Fajr, you find a person ما يصلي بالجماعة, he does not pray in Jama'ah, in congregation, no من النفاق. Is a sign of hypocrisy, because hypocrites stay away from Salatul Fajr and Salatul Isha. If you knew the reward of these two prayers, you would come habwan, crawling like a baby to the masjid. This is the real success of the Muslim Ummah. That some of us, we find it trivial. We can spend hours outside the masjid talking about this, talking about that. But what do we find? How many people will then question their own self? You know, the companions, if they miss Jama'a khalf al-Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, or anybody missed it, they'll classify that individual as a munafiq. Because why they're not there behind the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam? وَحَتَّى الْمُنَافِقُونَ at the side point used to come and pray behind the Prophet alayhi salam. Munafiqun used to pray behind him because they didn't want to be exposed. They didn't want to be exposed to come. We're Muslims today. We're Muslims today. We think nothing, we find it trivial. That comes to Salatul Fajr, what importance, what relevance does it have? They will hide in the crooks and the crevices in the corner that nobody could spot them if they missed Jama'ah. And we can find a few fingertips we can count of people coming there. This is the real laziness we need to overcome. That many of us, we think that this is great things that we're conquering inside our life. Conquer your lust, your desires, your temptations. Don't look at the greater things. They will come eventually for people. That's why ulul azm min ar-rusul, people with lofty aspirations. Hatta ulama have written rasail kutub talking about people of lofty aspirations. Read the seerah. Read Sir A'lam al-Nubula, Imam Dhahabi, somewhat 15, 20 odd volumes in Arabic. Read them, talking about the lives of people who have lofty aspirations. كانوا قليلا من الليل ما يهجعون وبالأسحار هم يستغفرون. Very rarely do they sleep at nights. And the early part of the morning is seeking istighfar, forgiveness. We think that we're so busy in the things that we're doing. We think that certain moments in the weekend, a few hours here or there that we find is going to solve our problems. You find that 150 years of dismantling, حتى قبل 150 years that we find في وقت الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام. If you go back to ayat inside Surah Al-Imran that we find وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Read the tafsir of these ayat in some verse 104 of Surah Al-Imran onwards that we find discussing about the Muslim Ummah being divided. What is Al-Ansar? It is the coming together of two tribes, Al-Aws wal-Khazraj. And what was taking place by Al-Yahud at that time? Making Al-Aws wal-Khazraj fight amongst themselves so they could then control Medina. They can control Medina. Just like today that we find rivalry, infighting amongst Muslims that we find, and then just divide and conquer, split up the Muslims, take over their lands, their properties and everything that we find, and overcome us individuals. And as we find that even inside blessed areas that we find, it may sound harsh for many of us, even Baytul Maqdis, people talk about liberating Palestine that we find. How many people come there for Salatul Fajr? How many people are there? It's a fact, it's documented. Where's that zeal? Where's that passion? Where's that devotion? So this is a laziness that we need to overcome. And thus we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages us to respond to every call. Do the best. So ulama of hadith mentioned, every time you read a hadith, and it may not be something which you have to do, at least once in a while, try to implement the hadith. Don't learn knowledge for the sake of knowledge. This is becoming more and more common inside Al-Shabab, more and more. It's just al-ilm, likasb al-ilm. Learn knowledge for some gaining of knowledge. إنما العلم للتطبيق. Ilm, knowledge, is for implementation. As you find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down كتاب أنزلناه مبارك ليدبروا آياته وليتذكر أولو الألباب. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the book, the Qur'an, to ponder and to reflect upon it. Imam al-Hasan al-Basri mentioned يدبروا آياته ليطبقوا القرآن, to implement the Qur'an. The Qur'an is to be implemented inside your life, to follow the Qur'an. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a person tawfiq and ability to remind themselves, remind other individuals, هذا من الله نور على نور from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أما قصدك وغايتك, your whole intent of your life just becomes قصب العلم, to then find aqwal, to find statements, to make tanqeed al-nas, to say this about this, say this about that person. What is the benefit of that? Person doesn't gain knowledge just to make fawda between people. Person أولا رفع الجهل, to excuse himself from ignorance. لكي تعبد الله على بصيرة, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon foresightedness, upon ilm, be able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala appropriately. Likewise you find إنما يخشى الله من عباده العلماء. Quran said the people who fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are ulama, who understand the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, implement that inside their life to get them close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But many of us, we don't feel that is the role of ilm. That is the benefits of ilm, thamaratul ilm. What are the fruits of ilm? That's why Imam Ahmad rahmatullah praised a certain individual. And his students around him, he said that, how can you praise such an individual? وَلَيْسَ بِفَقِيهٍ wala mujtahid, wala muhaddith. Person isn't a scholarly individual, he isn't like such and such type of individual, but he has ra'sul ilm. He has the head of ilm. He has khashyatullah. He has the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why we find some of the awam min al-nas, some of the average people amongst us, they become better than us. We have all this ilm, but we don't implement, we don't live by it, but they hold fast to the things that they've learned inside their life and they carry it out. So a person reads and they study to respond to the call, to remove the laziness, to awaken themselves. As the Quran mentions, استجيبوا لربكم من قبل يأتي يوم لا مرد له من الله ما لكم من ملجأ يومئذ وما لكم من نكير. استجيبوا, respond to the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before something or calamity before you comes upon you. Likewise, يا أيها الذين آمنوا استجيبوا لله وللرسول إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم. Or you believe, respond to the call of Allah and then the call of His Messenger to that which will give you life. The Quran and the Sunnah gives the person an intent, gives the person a purpose in life. That's what the response, when a person responds to the Quran, responds to the Sunnah, it awakens the individual. That's why the masses of the people, they are dead, they are living, but they are dead according to the Sharia, because they don't respond to the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, to awaken us to respond to the call. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا ادخلوا في السلم كافة ولا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان. Or you believe, enter to Islam in totality. فاتقوا الله ما استطعتم. Do as much as you can of Islam that you can do to the best of your ability. Follow it inside your life. And that's what a Muslim should be. Wherever there's certain actions they have to do, or they've been encouraged to do, they try to do that inside their life to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions لِلَّذِينَ اسْتَجَابُوا لِرَبِّهِمُ الْحُسْنَى. Those who respond to the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for those individuals there will be al-husna. There will be goodness. Bountiful things will be given to them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives bushra, gives glad tidings, gives good things inside this dunya, and likewise inside the akhirah to the believers. But it all boils down to, once again, about the actions. What a person does to gain that end reward. That's why throughout the Quran, those who believe and have amal salih, those who believe and have righteous action, they are coupled together. You cannot separate the two and think that a person just believes and doesn't have righteous actions, but a person just does any type of actions and doesn't have the right belief. A person needs to have the right belief and then strengthen that with the righteous actions, because that is what will benefit the individual inside this dunya and more so inside the akhirah. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani talking about this hadith, explained this hadith about seeking benefit of 5 before 5. العاقل ينبغي له إذا أمسى لا ينتظر المساء. The intellectual individual is the one who in the evening doesn't wait till the morning, and in the morning doesn't wait till the evening, because the person knows that the ending will be coming. And obviously this is just possibly paraphrasing the famous hadith that we find. If you come to the evening, إذا أمسيت فلا تنتظر الصباح وإذا أصبحت فلا تنتظر المساء. If you come to the evening, don't wait for the morning. In the morning, don't wait for the evening. You take from your life before your death. You take from your health before you fall sick. So here Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani is highlighting the same point, that person, when they look at such a hadith, it's about preparation, because these فهذه الخمسة لا يعرف قدرها إلا بعد زوالها. No one really will be able to give its due right of these 5 elements until they're lost. That's what most of us become. When it's taken away from us, that's when we begin to reflect, as Imam al-Mannawi, Sahib al-Fayd al-Qadir, mentions, that the person doesn't give due relevance to this until it's taken away from them. Then they begin to reflect upon the life what's gone past them. Likewise, you find Ibn Atiyya inside his Tafsir al-Muharrar al-Wajiz, fi Tafsir al-Karim al-Aziz, وَسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ. وَيُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ, they race in doing good deeds. And then he brings this hadith to discuss about racing and doing good deeds. That a person doesn't wait. Person is, whenever they have the opportunity, they're always racing to do good deeds. Obviously, there's certain moments that we find al-amakin wal-mawatin, certain stations, certain places, certain times and locations are more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The person needs to use those moments to increase inside their ibadat. But we find that in a normal day that we find, حَبُّ الْعَمَلِ إِلَى اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى أَدْوَمُهَا وَإِنْ قَلَّا. The most beloved actions to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are actions which are done on a regular basis, even they happen to be minute or small. So a person may excuse the expression, boast that all Ramadan they read the Quran and the rest of the year don't read the Quran. But a person yawmin every day, yaqra safha, reads a page, reads 2 pages, whatever it may be, is our ability, and reads it every single day throughout the year, is far better than a person who just focuses it upon once inside the month that we find. So that's the distinction that we find, that a person may take moments of passion of zeal and let that carry out throughout the rest of the year. Based upon the hadith that we find, al-Jum'ah ila al-Jum'ati wa Ramadan ila Ramadan. We find one Friday prayer to another Friday prayer, or Salah ila Salah, one prayer to one Salah, one Jum'ah to another Jum'ah, one Ramadan to another Ramadan is kafarat. The expiation sins whatever takes place between the two. Meaning that the impact, the ulama of hadith will mention, the impact of one prayer, the Iman of one prayer leads you to the following prayer. That when your Iman begins to go down, your Iman is increased with another prayer. So the impact of one prayer, the impact of it is in between that short span of time. The impact of one Jum'ah to the next 7 days carries on to the following Jum'ah. And the impact of 29, 30 days of fasting, the impact of that lies all the way until Sha'ban. And as Ramadan enters, then the person is uplifted again. It doesn't mean that the person just thinks that I've just done what I had to do. This was becoming more and more a culture inside our lives and our practice that we find that I've done what I had to do. There's more that we could do. There's more that we can exert in ourselves and do better than that. Likewise, the famous hadith that we find, نِعْمَتَانِ مَغْبُونٌ فِيهِمَا كَثِيرٌ مِنَ النَّاسِ الصِّحَّةُ وَالْفَرَاغُ. 2 blessings that many individuals are lost regarding it. They're unaware regarding it. الصِّحَّةُ وَالْفَرَاغُ is good health and spare time. That people fail to avail these opportunities. So these 5 elements that we find, avail your youth when you're young, your health, your wealth, your time, and your life. This is what a Muslim should be focusing inside their life. And even all of these 5 elements, they all, in general, they begin to overlap at times, whether it be inside Quranic ayat, inside hadith tradition that we find. And even all of them can come together. As we find one of the best examples, if you look at Surah Al-Asr, inside the surah talking about time, etc. that we find, Imam Shafi'i mentioned about this surah, if only this surah was sent down, it would suffice this Muslim ummah. If only this one surah was sent down, it would suffice this Muslim ummah. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Indeed, by time, man is in a state of loss. Even this, if you rakiz al-kalimat, Arabiya, look at these words in great detail and dissect them that you find, it doesn't say man is in loss. It says, verily indeed man is in a state of loss. That's a rough rendition in the English language. Because tawqeed ba'da tawqeed. Overemphasis again and again and again that there is definitely most of mankind are in a state of loss. Except for those who believe and carry out the righteous actions. And who encourage one another towards the truth, cooperation upon the truth, and likewise towards patience to encourage one another. And that's as they mention that time is the most easiest thing to lose. Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making al-qasam bil-waqt? Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taking a promise by time? And as a side point, you find that throughout the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always revolving anything related to time. Wal-qamar, wal-shams, wal-duha, wal-nahar that we find, wal-asr, wal-fajr, wal-duha, wal-layl. Throughout the Qur'an that we find, always Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes moments of time, moments there, for what purpose? To send out the message to avail the opportunity. And that's you find from amongst these signs of the creation, night and the day that we find, and likewise the creation of the sun and the moon. For the person, لِمَنْ أَرَادَ أَنْ يَذَّكَّرَ أَوْ أَرَادَ شُكُورًا. Whoever wants to ponder and become grateful. And then straight after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, what after straight this ayah? Inside Surah Al-Furqan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. شيء عجيب. إذا ركزتم على القرآن, the Quran, every single word, if you study in great detail, you find what is known a deep science. Some of the ulama begin to question about it. ولكن صراحة there is a great deep science. What is known الربط بين الكلمات والآيات والصور. A link of words inside the Quran, ayat inside the Quran, and surahs inside the Quran. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses certain words and moves from certain verses to another verse, from one topic to another topic, to one theme to another theme. There is a deep science in that. That's what Imam Suyuti wrote a whole magnanimous work talking about link of ayat inside the Quran. You know, some ulama, they don't focus so much upon it, but there is a deep element of science of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choosing and selecting certain words and certain passages and placing them there. So after speaking about the creation of the night, the day, the sun and the moon, then highlighting that Ibadur Rahman, servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those individuals that who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are focused on their devotion, and they don't get derailed, they don't get distracted. وَإِذَا خَاطَمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. Ignorant individuals, they pester them, they disturb them, they try to derail them, try to take them away. Because you find that to gain something, there's going to be obstacles. A person shouldn't think that in a moment of time a person gains certain things. حتى في العلم that you find is تعب مشقة. Inside ilm that you find is hard, it's difficulty, there's obstacles. Not everyone avails or gains that knowledge that is due right. That all of us may think that it's something basit, something simple and easy. It is that ilm is thaqeel. Knowledge is something very, very heavy, very, very powerful that we find. لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله. We sent down this Quran on a mountain or cleft it asunder. That's what ilm is. Al-Quran is something heavy upon the heart and the mind of the individual. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, returning back to the purpose of the human being upon this earth, numerous ayat inside the Quran to encourage us to not have this laxical approach, or this approach of what we find excessive entertainment. We're not against, if we can use such words as Islamic entertainment aside, but there's no such thing as Islamic anashid. It's just anashid. You can't give it the title of being Islamic. Just call it anashid, whatever it may be. But the point here being is about being focused, about focus inside our lives and looking at greater objectives, greater goals, greater achievements that we find. And if a person understands that what are they doing on the face of this earth? أَفَحَسِبْتُمْ أَنَّمَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ عَبَثًا وَأَنَّكُمْ إِلَيْنَا لَا تُرْجَعُونَ. Do you think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you without any purpose, without any intent, just decided to create the heavens and the earth, and all this Darwin's theory, atheist beliefs, etc. that we find? Just the earth is just a beautiful beautification of the dunya being placed there. And even Muslims begin to marvel and looking at the stars and the moon and this, that and the other that we find. Is this all that we think our life is? فَصِيحُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, go and explore the land. That's it. لا. أَفَحَسِبْتُمْ أَنَّمَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ عَبَثًا وَأَنَّكُمْ إِلَيْنَا لَا تُرْجَعُونَ. Ishara, hatta Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the beauty of this world and whatever it may be. Do you think that you're not going to return back to us? That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to highlight. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, أَيَحْسَبُ الْإِنسَانُ أَنْ يُتْرَكَ السُّدَى. Does the human being think we're going to just leave you alone? That's it, you're just placed upon this earth. تَأْكُلْ وَتَشْرَبْ وَتَنَامْ. You eat, you drink, you sleep. كَالْبَهَائِمْ. You know the Quran, look how unique the Quran is. Quran mentions أُولَٰئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. هؤلاء, and this festive period that we find. Quran, they get very offensive, don't they? But the Quran is highlighting truth. They eat, drink, sleep, fornicate, defecate. That's it. أُولَٰئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. Quran says they're like cattle, like beasts. But you know the beast? He knows his way to find his pen, to his stable. He finds his way home. Ha'ulai, you might find some of them, may Allah guide them, asking for a bus fare or ticket fare or a taxi to get home, isn't it? أُولَٰئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. That's what the Quran says, they're more astray. Quran is saying that at least the beast will find his way home, but they become so astray because their whole life becomes what? It's shahawat, it becomes desires, intoxicating themselves, losing themselves. They don't know what their intent is, what their purpose is. And likewise, you find, sorry to mention such harsh statements, even amongst our own Muslim youth at that moment, it has become common practice to live a life of ma'asi, of disobedience, and then to become obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When many of us were growing up, كَانَ نَادِرًا. It was very rare that Muslim youth was involved in haram things, that one person would stand out. Now it's the opposite. Most Muslim youth live haram lifestyle, do haram, then they find guidance. We're not making them feel bad, but this is why a lack of engagement inside society to awaken society. You find a famous hadith that we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala marvels at a young individual, la sabwata lahu. The person has no, what ulama, Imam Mannawi, Sahib Fayd al-Qadir mentions, la yamilu ila al-hawa. La sabwa lahu, bima'na, this person, young individual, doesn't go towards temptation and desires. And he mentions, inna hadha nadir. This is very, very rare. It's very rare that a young individual tries to stay away from temptations and desires. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala marvels at this individual, praises this individual. And this is all going back to this hadith.
gain when you're a young individual. Gain benefit when you're a young individual. That's why we find 7 types of individuals under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whereby there will be no shade. شاب نشأ في طاعة الله في عبادة الله. A young individual who grew up spending their life obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a virtue. That's a blessing. Imagine that 7 will be under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whilst Imam Nawawi read his seerah, Sahib Riyadh al-Salihin, or Sharh of Sahih Muslim in 18 volumes that we find. What does he mention? If you read his seerah about the life of Imam Nawawi that we find, I'm not saying that we should do this or train our children to do this, but just to give us a glimpse. He would weep when children used to tell him to come and play with them. He wouldn't want to play with them. That's why he was focusing on what he wanted to do, what he wanted to gain inside his life. That's the type of personality that he was. That's why we read the seerah of many of the ulama, their life, what they became in their focus, in their devotion, commitment. Even we can have a few individuals who follow that same path. It will help to illuminate this Muslim ummah once again, rather than to become a ummah of laxity that we find. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said Surah Al-Dhariyat that we find in the 51st chapter of the Quran, some verse 55 or so. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create the jinn and the human being لِيَعْبُدُونَ. In some other qira'at or other wordings that we find, بِمَعْنَى لِيُوَحِّدُونَ. Only to single out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for worship. That's the whole purpose of being placed upon this earth. Everything else becomes secondary, becomes tertiary, becomes irrelevant. That the real essence of being placed upon this dunya is ibadatullah. In the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and calling people to that worship and reminding people about the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus we find that obviously a person cannot turn back the clock of their life, as they say. But a person should not despair. A person shouldn't lose hope, because al-qayyisu man dana nafsahu. The intelligent individual is the one who brings oneself to judgment, begins to rectify themselves. That's why going back to Umar al-Khattab mentioned, حَاسِبُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ قَبْلَ أَن تُحَاسَبُوا. Bring yourself to accountability before you're brought forth to accountability. That's an intelligent individual who sees what's taking place in their life, what's taking place inside their life. What do they need to do? What do they need to retract inside their life? What do they need to improve inside their life? And they become focused towards that. That's the Quran mentioned, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ. O my servants who have oppressed their own selves, who've gone beyond the bounds, gone beyond the limitations, لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ. Do not despair of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ جَمِيعًا إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wipes out all sins. So a person, whatever is trying to rectify themselves, trying to better themselves, and that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always, even when talking about people who committed major sins, once again, going back to Surah Al-Furqan, that we find people, believers, those individuals don't commit zina, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, don't do haram things. And whoever does those actions, then they repent and do righteous actions, turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَأُولَٰئِكَ يُبَدِّلُ اللَّهُ سَيِّئَاتِهِمْ حَسَنَاتٍ وَكَانَ اللَّهُ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that He will change their bad deeds into good deeds. This is the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has no benefit in punishing this Muslim ummah. That some of us may think, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and even all this taking place at the moment around us, it is hikmatullahi baligha. It is the immense wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which there is no doubt regarding that, to awaken us once again. أَوَلَا يَرَوْنَ أَنَّهُمْ يُفْتَنُونَ فِي كُلِّ عَامٍ مَرَّةً أَوْ مَرَّتَيْنِ ثُمَّ لَا يَتُوبُونَ وَلَا هُمْ يَذَّكَّرُونَ. Don't they see that they'll be tested once in a year, twice in a year, that they may repent and turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's what all this is. If resurgence, reawakening, or finding our direction, finding our obedience towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will strengthen. That's why many ulama have documented that for some of our young individuals, we like to just see global empires and khilafah and this flag and this that taking place. The great crux of the issue is disobedience. Awwalan is shirk billahi subhanahu wa ta'ala, associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rampant on the face of this earth till this day. And then secondly is disobedience. ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعد الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون. شيء عجيب. Quran Surah Al mentions corruptions appeared upon the land and the oceans because what man has sent forth with his own hands. And then what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, you may taste the fruits of your own actions and do what? With these tests and these trials, that you may then return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, to awaken this Muslim ummah, to wake up once again. Person shouldn't despair, shouldn't lose hope, shouldn't fret. There's going to be much khair. That's why this Muslim ummah has been described in prophetic traditions. We don't know where the khair is. This ummah, kal-ghaythi, kal-matar, is like the rain. You don't know whether the goodness is in the beginning, in the middle, or in the end. Rain is something beautiful. It's a blessing that you find the dawab, the beasts, the fruits, the vegetations, and nas, all benefit from it. The benefit is there. That's what this Muslim ummah is. There's always going to be benefit inside this Muslim ummah. Whoever said this Muslim ummah has been destroyed, then he's the one that destroyed this Muslim ummah. No one should think that this Muslim ummah, because this Muslim ummah as a side point, will never ever be destroyed. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he prayed that this Muslim ummah asked for 3 supplications, and you find one of them was responded, that this Muslim ummah will never be destroyed. But it will happen. What will happen? It will fight, unfortunately, amongst itself. There's prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ that they will fight. Just like we, excuse the language, we squabble amongst ourselves, don't we? About ara'ul fiqhiyya. هذه قلة العلم. It's a lack of knowledge. Whether a person does رفع يدين تأمين خلف الإمام or تحرك إصبعه في التشهد كذا, is he moving it fast enough? Is he really a person of sunnah? This shows قلة العلم. That's because we condensed our life in these things. I'm not saying, I'm not trying to belittle these actions, don't get me wrong. Because this is tazeen salah. This is beautification of salah, Imam Shafi'i mentioned. But we find that our life parameters just become based upon that. If a person does certain actions, then he must be sahib al-sunnah. وَكَمْ مِنَ الْفُقَّهَاءِ. How many fuqaha, how many ulama of hadith may have not implemented that? What do you say about them now? Do you now reject them because he never moved his finger in that manner, so he's not really a person of sunnah? Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah is far deeper than that, ya ayyuhal ikhwa. It's far deeper inside that in wala wal bara, in their belief and their conviction that we find even some of the ulama. When you find munaqashat, when you find harsh words being said amongst themselves and rivalry amongst themselves, but when you find that when they would meet and discuss, you find ghayatul adab. You find adab ma natasawwar, that we've not been taught inside our life. Adab that we don't know what the meaning of adab is. This is what this bi'ah, this is what this society, it teaches us. An element of what we don't know, what the benefits of what the real intent of our ilm is, what the real intent of our life is. That begins to get focused upon issues that begin to derail us, begin to take us away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as a person then at a later stage of their life, many people ask the question, is there anything that a person would have done better inside their life? Shall I tell you what it is? It's the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's the Qur'an. Because every single Islamic science and everything that flows, it flows from the Qur'an. Whoever focuses upon the Qur'an, because the Qur'an, as they say, is an ocean that has no ending. It has no ending. Ba'd al-ulama, tafasir, they read for 40 to 50 years. Read kutub al-tafasir, 40 to 50 years they read it, and then they began to write tafsir. وَأَنْتَ تُفَسِّرُ الْقُرْآنِ بِالْآيَةِ بِاللُّغَةِ الْإِنْجِلِيزِيَّةِ. You make tafsir al-Qur'an by reading one verse in English. 40 to 50 years they read it, then they began to transcribe it. And as a side point, you find works of tafsir, the only thing that we find in English language is tafsir ibn Kathir. That's even a mukhtasar. That's a summarized version printed in what? 10 volumes. Try and read that firstly. That's a summarized version. That's only one book of tafsir that we find. You find Imam al-Baghawi, al-Qurtubi, al-Tabari that we find, al-Lusi that we find, other Ibn Hibban, Hayyan that we find tafsir, all other classical works, Imam Shawkani's Fath al-Qabil that we find, Imam Suyuti's Dur al-Manthur that we find, numerous tafsir out there that we find. So a person, how did these people, you find Imam Qurtubi write about him, if you look at his lifespan, died at the age of 44 or so. How did he compile such a magnificent tafsir if he died at such a young age? And he divided his time and his moments, and he must have been writing at least 40 odd pages a day, not cutting and pasting on the computer, writing 40 pages a day. How did he get to write 40 pages a day with ink? To get to such a level that we find. And even if you find as a side point, we began with Shaykh Nasiruddin al-Albani rahmatullah alayh, there's stories about him, documented about his life that we find that one page he was looking for, they call it Waraqatul Mafquda, the missing page out of the manuscript he's reading. And he spent time and time, I don't know how long, trying to find it. If we'd go up the ladder, reading something, you'd stay there for 4 hours. Stay there for so long he's reading. That's what you find. If you look at even those people who don't like him or don't agree with him, if you look at his checkings that you find and what he did, you find immense barakah inside his life. Immense barakah that you find in what he was doing. A systematic approach in what he's doing inside his life. Sheikh Nasr al-Albani rahmatullahi alayhi, هل كان من العرب? Was he an Arab scholar? Was he? He's from Albania. He's an Albanian individual. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him to give him that tawfiq and ability, that then what do we find? In an ummah, this ummah, you find that people who've gone past, they're just forgotten about. But people who remember is fudala'uhum. The most virtuous and the best of them are always remembered with khair and goodness. And that's what a person needs to be remembered with khair and goodness towards the people. Likewise, Allah subhanahu continues these ayat about individuals going away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, وَيَوْمَ يَعَدُّ الظَّالِمُ عَلَى يَدَيْهِ يَقُولُ يَا لَيْتَنِي. The person that they will bite upon their hands, اتَّخَذْتُ مَعَ رَسُولِ سَبِيلًا. If only I took in the path of the messenger. يَا وَيْلَةَ لَيْتَنِي لَمْ أَتَّخِذْ فُلَانًا خَلِيلًا لَقَدْ أَضَلَّنِي عَنِ الذِّكْرِ بَعْدَ إِذْ جَاءَنِي وَكَانَ الشَّيْطَانُ لِلْإِنسَانِ خَذُولًا. Person will say, woe to me on that day. Woe to me that I took such and such an individual as my friend. لَقَدْ أَضَلَّنِي عَنِ الذِّكْرِ بَعْدَ إِذْ جَاءَنِي. As the Qur'an is speaking to us today, He took me away from the remembrance of Allah when guidance was shown to me. So what does this teach us? About people who are just wasting their time, who are not focused, who are not committed. Let's find prophetic traditions. Al-mar'u ala dini khalilihi. A man is upon the religion, the way of life of his friend. Likewise, al-mar'u ma'a man ahabba. A person will be with whomever they love. As we find that Sha'ir wrote the lines of poetry, I'm not from amongst the pious individuals or these noble individuals to be with them. And that's why I say, even if you don't learn from the ulama, some of us who may go out and study in Medina, obviously the brothers here have done well, mashallah, but they know what I'm referring to. We just go there and boast about being with the ulama. Even if you don't learn, we learn so many beautiful things from them. There's so many things that you learn from them that you won't learn from anywhere else. So even the person learns adab, learns speech, learns etiquette, that's enough to suffice them to help us inside this community that would help us. So a person, if they become wasting their time, spending their time with individuals that will not benefit them and derailing them, then this leads to laziness, laxity, leads to not worrying about the affairs of oneself in this Muslim ummah. And that's you find in the prophetic tradition as well about the benefits of suhbah, companionship, and being with good individuals and encouraging one another that we find. Is the parable of Hamilul Misk wa Nafiqul Kir. The person the carrier of perfume and the one who blows in the bellows, the iron smith. So the carrier of musk or perfume, that even if you don't physically buy the perfume, you find that some of the sweet smelling fragrance will rub off on your clothing. And if you stand with people who just stand with a blacksmith, what will happen? Then some of the smoke from the furnace, etc., will come on your clothing and burn you and leave a foul stench upon you. And this is a parable of good friends and bad friends. As with good people, inshallah, the person encourages them to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The person sees them, they begin to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They begin to exert themselves. So friends need to be good friends and encouraging the people around you. Many people we find as they come from various backgrounds and various activities. Our job as a Muslim is to encourage them, to remind them, وَذَكِّرْهُمْ بِأَيَّامِ اللَّهِ. Remind them about the days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to become better individuals. Don't think that the companions, obviously here we're talking about in the concept of seerah, that they had certain actions that they'd done. That if you looked at the state of Jahiliyyah at that time, it's something we cannot even imagine. But the sending of the Prophet ﷺ, it brought them out of the realms of their darknesses and brought them to that nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what guidance does. That's why even some of the ulama that you find about them, you read about their life, or a person reads and thinks, marvels at them. And then if you look at the seerah of some of these individuals, Fudayl ibn Iyad, if I'm not mistaken, they highlight Fudayl ibn Iyad was a highway robber. He was a robber. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he changed his life, and now he becomes many works of tazkiyah and quotations that we find are referring back to him. Imam al-Baghawi inside his tafsir quotes him a number of times as well. So look at the virtue of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can take any individual, if the person becomes mukhlis, becomes sincere inside their life, and change, bring much khair and goodness out of that individual. Even Imam Mahdi, that the whole Muslim ummah is waiting, as well as various recitals, various books have been written, three individuals the whole world is waiting for. If you read Sifat of Al-Mahdi that we find, as ulama have concluded, he's not a scholar. According to hadith that we find, is going to be an individual that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will rectify him. Will rectify him overnight, then in the morning he becomes the leader of the people. So some of us may have this connotation that Imam Mahdi may be this divine religious individual and is going to come. Yes, we want this Muslim Ummah to be rectified. We want this Muslim Ummah to return back to its glory. And it will come, there's no doubt about that. It's just, these are only days that we alternate between mankind. And the person, all that they can do is remain focused. Because even if we don't meet those days, that our life may be taken before that. So that's when a person will begin to then say, the Qur'an mentions, حَتَّى إِذَا جَاءَ أَحَدَهُمُ الْمَوْتِ قَالَ رَبِّ ارْجِعُونَ لَعَلِّي أَعْمَلُ صَالِحًا فِي مَا تَرَكْتُ. Then a person is going to say, oh my Lord, let me go back to this dunya and carry out righteous actions upon this earth. كَلَّا إِنَّهَا كَلِمَةٌ هُوَ قَائِلُهَا وَمِنْ وَرَائِهِمْ بَرْزَخٌ إِلَى يَوْمِ يُبْعَثُونَ. These are only vague words, they're empty words. You had enough opportunity on this world to do the right actions you need to do. And now you're saying when death has come upon you, or you live in this dunya, رَبِّ ارْجِعُونِ. Oh my Lord, let me come down upon this earth and let me do righteous action. That's why the side point, you find that inside Jannah, there's no actions. You know, people in their zeal and passion, when I get to Jannah, I'll start praying, I'll start doing this, I'll start doing that. Yeah, that's a dunya, here, مكان العمل. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ مُسْتَقَرٌ وَمَتَاعٌ إِلَى حِينٍ. This is the place, مَزْرَعَ الدُّنْيا. This is the planting seeds for al-akhirah. There's no worrying about as-salah inside Jannah. There's no worrying about as-salah or fasting or hajj. There's no worry about that. So this shows our mentality state of affairs. Or we begin to leave things to a later stage. In the Qur'an, the manhaj of the Qur'an is very accurate. Even aside when you study Surah Yusuf that we find, the brethren of Yusuf alayhi salam that we find, what was their mentality that summarizes many of us today? That we're going to carry out this action of whether to throw him into the well or to kill him, etc. Fine. وَتَكُونُ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ قَوْمًا صَالِحِينَ. Then after this, we're going to become righteous individuals. How many young Muslims today? Some Muslims, subhanAllah, there's no exaggeration. They'll come and say to me, Shaykh, we know this is haram and this is like this, this is like this, this is like that. And hatta yarwi a hadith, narrating a hadith to me and telling me this. But where's the action? Where's the implementation? Or making nooks and crevices like al-Yahud inside. No, the hadith means this, but it still means we can do this. Hadith says this, but I can still have shisha and maybe because it's not quite clear. وتعرف الأدلة, all the adillah. لما كنا في الجامعة, the question came about ما هو حكم التدخين في الإسلام. What is the ruling of smoking cigarettes inside Islam? Students write pages after pages, back after research after research, everything. This is Jami'at al-Islamiyya. Come out the exam. Wrote whole essay about how smoking is haram. Come out and have a cigarette. Rip the paper up, throw it in the bin. If I ever get to become your teacher, that's what I will do. Rip it up, throw it in the bin. That you find that some of our teachers should walk into the second, with someone watching television, the satellite dishes, whatever it may be, they would despise those teachers. They would despise those teachers. وَحَتَّى لَمَّا نَقُلْنَا نُسَجِّلَ الْمَوَادِ. You should write down certain subjects. People should come and say, Sheikh Fulan, لا تأخذ هذه المادة عنده. Don't take this subject with that teacher. قلنا ليش لماذا؟ لأنه متشدد. He's a harsh teacher. He's not a harsh teacher. لأنه يطبق السنة. Because he implements the sunnah. And wallahi, I learned that those were the best teachers. Who always want the khair and goodness. That's what they wanted for the students. They weren't there because you don't think Islamic studies it's just a shahada. It's just a testimony. You can just rip it up, throw it in the bin. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean anything that all of us become baffled and bamboozled that we do this now. It's what you learn, you benefit from it. For the action that before the time comes for the individual, that they return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to return me back to this dunya. Likewise in our normal affairs as well. How many of us will be losing hope? Or will lose hope? Or lose that focus? And then when death comes upon us, then we begin to worry, if only I did this, if only I done that. So thus we find in conclusion that on the day of judgment, all this is paraphrased in another hadith that we find, that the foot of son of Adam will not move until he's asked about his time, about his waqt, his age, about his money, how he earned his wealth, how he spent his wealth, how the person gained the knowledge, and what they've done with that knowledge they gained. and about their body as well, how they took care of their body. All these affairs that we find, all of us will be asked about. So these are the 5 affairs I wanted to really touch upon, that all of us should begin to, as I began, we begin to prepare ourselves to be worried about these affairs when we're young individuals before we become older. As a side point, young is anybody under the age of arba'in, according to Islamic meanings. So alhamdulillah, most of you know above 40. So anybody under the age of 40 is classified as a young individual, according to Sharia. So below 40, obviously, alhamdulillah, someone's past that. But we still haven't reached wisdom. But wisdom that we find, that's why it's just to alleviate the atmosphere. You find that once a person came, Ibn Taymiyyah, I think he talks about it, or Imam Ghazali. I'm not promoting the views of Imam Ghazali, but just in Bab al-Tazkiyah that we find, in works of Ihya al-Din, we find many discrepancies inside it. But in Bab al-Tazkiyah that we find Imam Ghazali, that he mentioned that a person came to him and asked him the question that, I want to gain wisdom. How can I gain wisdom inside my life? So he said to him that for 40 days, become sincere. Become, 40 days, blessed, isn't it? Blessed number of days, eh? قد يكون استدلال من القرآن. موسى عليه السلام went for 30 days, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increased it, became what? 40 يوم, became 40 days that we find. Likewise, the blowing of the soul after 40 days, etc. that we find. Other affairs that could make istidlal. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide those individuals who make focus upon 40 days. The ayah that we find, so that he said to him that become sincere for 40 days. So this person took it as revelation and began to focus. After 40 days, he came back and he said that, I don't see any wisdom. In 40 days, I tried to be sincere, and there's no wisdom flowing out of me. He said, إِنَّمَا أَخْلَصْتَ لِلْحِكْمَةِ وَمَا أَخْلَصْتَ لِلَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. You became sincere for wisdom. You didn't become sincere for Allah. If you became sincere for Allah, Allah would have granted you wisdom. So your gain was just al-ilm. Your gain was only this. Your gain was only that. It wasn't given to you. Thus you find, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ. Fear Allah, and Allah will teach you. Fear Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will teach you, open up the understanding of the Qur'an and Sunnah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability that at a young age to benefit before we become old. Give us the ability that when we're healthy and in a good state, before we become sick, to benefit ourselves. Likewise, in a state of wealth, before we go fall into a state of poverty, because we find in al-faqr, in qareeb ila al-kufr, poverty to lead the person to eventually become in a state of disbelief, and to benefit from our time before we become busy with family, with children, and life in general that we find, and finally take benefit of our life before any death comes upon us. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولجميع المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه غفور رحيم. بارك الله فيكم.